Right. Once more, good day, everyone. This is lecture 15. We are still in the period of the Enlightenment. And today what we want to look at are some of the founders of what came to be called the existentialist movement or existentialist philosophy. Now, existentialist philosophy became extremely important in the post-war period. That's the post-Second World War period. And it would have been, to a large extent, the experiences of the two world wars, the First and the Second World War, and the tragic circumstances that resulted from those wars that would have led to the popularity of existentialism in the 1950s and 1960s. Still continues to be quite a popular philosophy, the kind of philosophy which catches the attention more readily of the average person than the very subtle epistemologies and the ontologies of traditional philosophical systems. But today what I'm doing is to look at the men who were considered to be the actual founders of existentialism, and they were 19th century thinkers. And they played an important role in that turn of Western philosophy from what came to be regarded as modernism, philosophy of progress, Western rationalism, and empiricism to some extent. And it expressed a kind of what people called in the end of the 19th century, a kind of ennui. It's a French word meaning tiredness, weariness, a fin de siècle kind of moment. Fin de siècle, again, a French term meaning end of the century. Very often at the end of the century, people do have feelings of pessimism, right? Things have changed. The world is changing. There's a sense that the world is changing. Time is moving on and so on. A sense of the transience of life and the insufficiency of the human. So the two thinkers that I'm dealing with are very interesting because they provide a superb contrast to each other, right? The first is Soren Kierkegaard, and the second is Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, the last day we spoke about Hegel, and I did point out that Hegel's philosophy, although in a sense apparently very remote, and you read a book like The Phenomenology of Spirit, it's a very difficult book to read. It's tense, right? It's profound, certainly, but it seems to articulate a worldview that is so very strange. It's levels of abstraction, for example, are something that can really be problematic in any attempt at understanding precisely what Hegel is talking about. But essentially what Hegel was doing, as I indicated last time, was that he was replacing the individual subjectivity or the individual subject or the individual person by an absolute general subjectivity, what he called absolute spirit, what clearly can be identified with any deistic or theistic system as God. And he was giving that new subjectivity a particular role in the development of human history and in the formation of the material and physical universe. Essentially, that primary subject, that primordial subject, that absolute spirit, which we can identify very easily with God, was the single subject. And very similar to Spinoza, the individual no longer counted in that system. The individual was merely a moment in the totality. And all that the individual's role and function was to reflect his particular positionality or location within that totality. The implications of that were therefore the subsumption of the individual to a larger system. The individual is no longer significant. The individual person, what was significant was the larger whole. In terms of the political arena, it would have been the state, right? In terms of the individual's experiences, it was now subordinated to the dialectic that defined the evolution of the universe and the evolution of absolute spirit. And so the Hegelian system was a system that really masked the individual, almost made the individual disappear from the landscape of philosophical and theoretical discussions. Existentialism was a response to that Hegelian system, a critical response to that system, virtually a rejection of that system. And the two men who, virtually contemporaries of Hegel himself, right, the two men who reacted so fervently to what they considered to be the weightiness of that Hegelian dialectic, that Hegelian movement in history. The two men were Søren Kierkegaard, who was a Christian existentialist. He was the father of Christian existentialism, and Friedrich Nietzsche, who was the father of Western European nihilism and atheism to some extent. Now, first I will deal with Kierkegaard. We can see predecessors or precursors to Kierkegaard in the unfoldment of modern Western philosophy. I may have made passing reference to Blaise Pascal, who was a famous mathematician during the Renaissance period and physicist. The word Pascal is still used in the realm of digital technology because he made a significant contribution technologically to the development of calculating machines. He was one of the initiators, not only of the idea, but of the invention of calculating machines. But he had a very outstanding and remarkable conversion experience as a physicist. And he became one of the greatest apologists for the Christian faith during his era. So Blaise Pascal is, in a sense, and his emphasis, even though he was a physicist, his emphasis really was on the individual and the individual standing before his God. And so he can be seen as one of the early precursors of the existentialist movement. But generally, it is not before Kierkegaard that, and it is certainly in response to Hegel. Pascal was before Hegel. It is certainly in response to Hegel that modern existentialism in both versions, both its religious or Christian version and its anti-Christian, atheistic, nihilistic version, had its origins. Søren Kierkegaard was a Dane, right? He was Danish. And he was really very perturbed by the Hegelian concept of the absolute spirit as having a priority over the individual, and of the entire system that he had put together as being more significant philosophically than the life and experience of the individual. One of the interesting things about Hegel is that in spite of Hegel's abstraction in his philosophical surmisings, in spite of his abstractions, Hegel saw his system as a system which provided powerful metaphysical support to Christianity. And he saw the essence of Christianity to a large extent. The concept of man's salvation, the concept of human restoration, and so on. He saw all of that as inherent in the evolution of absolute spirit. The whole story of Christ, for example, his incarnation, his death on Calvary's cross, and so on, salvation for man. The whole question of the reestablishment of a broken link between humanity and divinity, all of these fundamental themes in Christianity. He saw these things as played out in his analysis of the dialectic of spirit. And so Hegel remained to a large extent a Christian, but his form of Christianity for Kierkegaard was empty and really meaningless. Kierkegaard took his Christianity very serious. You know, this was a time when there was an increasing rise. Remember, I said that earlier, with the birth of the Enlightenment movement, there was an increasing rise of secular culture, an increasing preoccupation of individuals with secular issues, and a marginalization to a large extent of religious concerns, a marginalization of the traditional Christian and religious worldviews, and in many quarters, an open rejection of Christianity. Hume, for example, was one of the first thinkers to be openly defiant towards the Christian religion, and became one of its earliest and main critics. So you had that gradual movement away from what was fundamentally a metaphysical, religious world picture to a very much more secular, scientifically based, technologically based world picture. What Kierkegaard felt was necessary was to not only restore the individual to a centrality of position within the modern world, whether that world was secular or whether that world was religious, but he was also attempting to restore Christianity to Christendom. Western civilization has often been referred to as Christendom, and he was certainly intent on restoring Christianity to Christendom, giving it once more a central place in the whole Christian worldview. Kierkegaard, therefore, decided, in opposition to the Hegelian, that overwhelming Hegelian system, to prioritize, right, or to privilege the individual over against the totality. It is the individual that is central. And what is significant about the Kierkegaardian position is that he's not seeing the individual through the traditional rationalistic worldviews as a being who expresses and is guided by his rational faculties, an individual who is necessarily making a certain kind of material progress in the world because of his superior intellect over against the rest of the mammalian or animal world. It is not through his reason. It is not through his empirical powers, the accuracy of his powers of empirical examination, observation, investigation. That is not what makes him so very important in this system. It is through the area of feeling. And many of these feelings may be considered to be negative feelings. The individual has to resolve very often problems of stress, problems of anxiety, problems of frustration. These are the things which preoccupy the individual. The individual has to be engaged in what he calls the formation of himself, the care of the self. That is a term that is very often used now. In fact, it derives from antiquity, from Plato and Aristotle, the notion of the care of the self. And the individual has to be concerned primarily with the care of the self, with the nurturing of his being, with the development of a personality that is able to make a positive intervention within the society and have a positive relationship with his fellows. That is what is of central concern to the individual. Not whether the world is spirit or matter, not whether there's a dialectic explaining the evolution of things, or whether the world is a static entity that remains unchanging at its most fundamental ontological levels. That's not what concerns the individual. What concerns the individual are feelings of dread, of his fear and trembling before his God, of his religious beliefs and ideas. These are the things that are of greatest concern to the individual. And these are the things, therefore, that serves as central to the Kierkegaardian system of philosophical existentialism. So the existentialists, therefore, were really very critical of very many of both camps in traditional Western Enlightenment philosophy. Remember, we talked about the two camps, the rationalists, European rationalists, and the Anglo-Saxons empiricists. Kant had made a fairly successful effort to pull them all together. But the existentialists were now departing from that particular worldview, even departing from the Kantian worldview. Because Kant, when you read Kant, both his critique of pure reason and his critique of practical reason and his critique of judgment, right, all of those productions, Kant still sees the individual in traditional positive terms. The individual as he may not use the term, but there's still the notion of the individual reflecting the imago Dei, the image of God. The individual as having a certain kind of nobility. Kant himself talks about the dignity and worth of the individual. Existentialism is not rejecting those fundamental notions of the individual's worth and dignity, but sees the individual as an individual who is tortured, and an individual who, to a large extent, is still experiencing a certain kind of dialectic, but not a Hegelian dialectic. And so Soren Kierkegaard wrote a number of very significant works. His first work was the Either Or, and then he wrote a work called The Fear and Trembling, The Sickness Unto Death, Training in Christianity, and concluding on Scientific Postscript. And I will make mention of each of them in turn. Now, in Either Or, there is that first Kierkegaardian attack on the Hegelian system. In Hegel, the dialectic involves a triadic movement from what he calls the thesis, the position that exists, to the antithesis, the exact opposite of that position, or the negation of the thesis. But that event, that contradiction that exists between thesis and antithesis finds a resolution in the synthesis. There's a mediatory movement or mediatory force that brings them together historically, brings them together in the realm of spirit. And so the third movement of the dialectic is the third stage of the dialectic. Second movement, the third stage, is the negation of the negation, or the resolution of the conflict, or the sublation, right, of the contradiction. So there's that triadic movement in Hegel, which explains the dialectic. And that dialectic is a dialectic which is oriented to human progress, movement forward in terms of absolute spirit. What Kierkegaard is opposing is a different kind of dialectic, a dialectic of either or, which has no resolution, no mediation at all, no resolution in a synthesis. But that fundamental either or remains characteristic of being, characteristic of human existence, characteristic of history. That essentially the experience of the individual is not the experience of sameness and rational order and harmony and continuity and so on, and progress. That's not the experience of the human person. In our struggle to survive, in our struggle to achieve an identity and a self and a presence in the world, in our struggle, in our standing, in our personal spiritual struggles, in our standing before God, we are experiencing a paradox. We are experiencing a contradiction. We are experiencing a dialectic, which is an unresolvable dialectic, a dialectic in which either confronts or. And that is the nature of human beings. When you look at the human being, there are negative and positive forces that are at play continuously in the individual's experience. And that is a situation that is never really resolved. So in either or, what Kierkegaard has offered us is a concept of a reality that is defined by paradox. Now, it is interesting to note that Kierkegaard is considered not only to be a philosopher, but to be a theologian. In fact, he is regarded as one of the fathers of modern theology. When we get to the philosophical theologians at the end of the course, because that's the last topic we're doing, we'll see how very indebted they all were to Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is, in a sense, rewriting the whole story of the whole Christian salvation story, but he's rewriting it not by falling back on a text, on a dogmatic tradition, on a body of theological notions, but by investigating what he calls his own subjectivity, his inwardness, his interiority. Kierkegaard's movement is a movement within the self, right? Where he is coming to look within and introspectively at the kind of being he is, at the kinds of experiences he has. And that is what provides the validation for his ultimate fate that he eventually comes to accept. So in the either or, he gives a picture of life as fundamentally paradoxical. And what eventually developed in a lot of Western theology was the theology of paradox. We come into the theology of paradox later on, as expressed by people like Paul Tillich and Karl Barth and so on, a theology which accepts the fundamental contradictions of human being and the fact that those contradictions do not necessarily find a resolution along the lines of the Hegelian dialectic. In Fear and Trembling, right, another very important work of Kierkegaard, he talks about the very important concept of human subjectivity as essentially constituting what really is regarded as truth. What has developed over the years, certainly within the modern period of philosophical discourse, was a notion that truths can either be objective or subjective, right? Objective truths are truths that define states of affairs in the objective, real, physical world outside of us. The empiricists were very much concerned with that truth. Their notion of reality was essentially a copy theory of reality, that reality, as we understand it, really provides us with a mirror. The mind is like a mirror that views that reality, that provides us with the sense data or sensory impressions that constitutes the basis of our knowledge. So there is that objective truth, even though it is a truth that is eventually modified by the categories of human consciousness, as we see in the Kantian system, or as is hinted at in the Lockean system, right? Locke talks about subjective and objective qualities. Yet that is the prior truth. And subjective truths are truths that are only acceptable by the individual who identifies them and who is able to derive an understanding of those truths from his own personal experience by looking inward. So that there is a hierarchization of truth, a privileging of the objective over the subjective. In Kierkegaard, it is subjective truth that is central, not objective truth. Objective truth is secondary to subjective truth. And Kierkegaard takes a text from the Gospels in order to validate that position, a very interesting text. And Christ said, I am the truth. Christ was talking about himself and his role in the whole salvific process. And he says, I am the truth, the way, and the life. Kierkegaard's interpretation of that statement is that truth is the subject is the truth. The I would be the subject is the truth. To say that the subject is the truth is to say that truth is subjectivity. Truth is located in my experience. What I know to be real are not the ideas and thoughts that are circulating within the culture, not even the concepts that come to me through religious instruction or religious exposure, not the ideas from the world of philosophy and so on. What is true to me is what I feel deeply in my veins, in my nerves, what I understand as I look within the self, what I experience from day to day, the pain and the suffering, the joys and the exhilarations that I experience. That is what constitutes my truth as an individual. And therefore, I have to begin my understanding and identification of truth from that point, the point of subjective truth, and then move outward to the objective world. And therefore, the human life he sees, again, he uses what we have called earlier the law of the three stages. He sees the human life as a life in which I am struggling to become a self. I am struggling to realize truth as subjectivity. But in that struggle, my experience goes through three fundamental stages: the stage of the aesthetic, the stage of the ethical, and the stage of the religious. Now, the aesthetic stage is a primordial stage. That is what characterizes us as human beings primarily. As human beings, we experience things in an immediate way. There's a certain kind of immediacy, a certain kind of intuitive grasping of reality as it is in the moment. When we talk about the aesthetic, very often we're talking about things like music and poetry and drama and so on. And when you look at all of these areas of culture defined as aesthetic, you realize that they deal really with the moment, right? The actor in a Hamlet play, acting the role of Hamlet, is Hamlet for the moment. When he leaves that stage, he's no longer Hamlet. So the notion of the aesthetic phase of life is a notion that suggests that our consciousness begins with an intuition of what is present to us at any given point in time and space, and the grasping and understanding of that. When we get to the second stage, the ethical stage, then we are looking beyond the moment. Then we are thinking of our commitment to others, or obligations to a fellow man, how we play our roles in the various capacities and positions and identities that characterize our personalities, how we play the role of father or teacher or student or son or president or CEO, right? How we play these roles are important. And these roles require making a decision, making a commitment, right? We have to be committed to something. Very often those commitments are to relationships that are beyond the present, or they are oriented to the future. I want to become. My trusting life, my whole philosophy of life is one in which I want eventually to rise to the position of an individual citizen who plays a very important part. Or I want to be a devout Christian, preparing myself for life in eternity, right? That those are the kinds of decisions we make. That is the ethical phase of life. But there is something beyond the ethical. The ethical is still very rationalistic. I am identifying the factors that must be taken into account in making decisions. Decision becomes very important. But at that stage in life, what I'm doing, right, is that I am making rational decisions. I'm rationalizing the situation. I'm weighing circumstances before I make the right decision. In the religious phase, which is the final phase, I take the leap of faith. And when Kierkegaard talks about the leap of faith, he is against that, even the medieval theological philosophical position of reconciling faith and reason. He's taking the position of Tertullian I made reference to Tertullian earlier. He's not like Luther condemning reason as a whore or saying that reason serves any purpose. He's not doing that at all. Reason has its role to play, and it's a very positive role to play, certainly at the level of the ethical. But when you get to the religious phase, you have to leap beyond reason. In a situation of situatedness, of faith, of total faith, where you listen to the voice of God, as it were, and your decisions are made on that. And in the fear and trembling, what Kierkegaard does is that he analyzes the story of Abraham. That is the central story in the Kierkegaardian position, and the central story that expresses the movement beyond the ethical and beyond the aesthetic to the religious. Abraham is commanded by God to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. And that makes absolutely no sense to Hegel. That is the most irrational instruction or order that could be given by God, because God promised him a son. He has one son. Well, Ishmael had departed. So that one son, Isaac, is now to be slaughtered and offered as a sacrifice. How will he therefore be the father of the great nation? How will his descendants be as numerous as the stars of the skies? How will they acquire the great wealth that God has promised them? So it is an extremely irrational decision. But what Abraham does is that he follows God's instructions. He takes the leap of faith. He puts everything into the hands of God. And he takes the journey up to the mountain to give his son, offer his son as a sacrifice to God. And God eventually accepts him and replaces the son by the lamb. What Kierkegaard says has happened here is that there is a suspension of the ethical. We are moving now beyond the ethical. The religious requires of us to move beyond the ethical in a dimension which in which the issues cannot be resolved by the use of our rational faculties. There's what he calls a religious teleological suspension of the ethical in obedience to God, a very heavy term. A religious teleological suspension of the ethical in obedience to God. Remember the word teleology or telos. That was one of the factors of causation in the Aristotelian system. The telos is the end. And anything that is oriented to the end is considered to be teleological, right? What Aristotle was saying when he talked about the end as a causation is that very often what is to become, what the individual or the object or the entity is to become at the end is what shapes their beginning, their development in the present, or what has shaped their development in the past. That eventually was rejected by modern science. Modernity did not accept that notion of the teleological, but Kierkegaard is bringing the teleological back into the picture, right? And he's arguing that what we are doing is that we are suspending the teleological. The ethical, in fact, there's a suspension of the ethical, a teleological suspension of the ethical, as we give our lives, as we make a decision to obey God. He was very much concerned with anxiety and despair. And in fact, Kierkegaard regarded despair as essentially sin. It is a despair, it begins as a despair of not willing to be a self. Very often when we investigate the problems of the human problem and the problem of sin, right, it goes down to the emotion of despair, that anxiety over our being, that uncertainty as to who we are, right, the problematic of the development and the formation of the self. So that in the care of the self, right, which we talked about earlier, we recognize that there is a very significant role that faith has to play in all of that. And we can only solve the problems of despair and the problems of anxiety when we take the leap of faith. The individual is higher than the universal. The individual is higher than the system, right? Because in the individual's primary concern is the care of the self. It is becoming a self, right? It is that preoccupies the individual, and it is that therefore must be the center of his religious commitment and his lifestyle. Kierkegaard was was the advocate of the Christian gospel, the Christian faith, and tried to bring Christianity back to Christendom. But he was certainly very predisposed, right, against institutionalized religion, right? He saw the essence of the Christian doctrine as what he called an offense and a scandal, the notion of the death of God, the notion of God dying to save man. That is an offensive idea. Remember that Paul makes reference to that when in its experience of preaching at Mars Hill, right? In fact, he says that Christianity is a laughing stock to the people, the Athenians. And to a large extent, what Paul did was that he in a way predicted the subtle conflicts that would arise between philosophy and theology, and the fact that philosophy, which is highly rationalistic, empirical stance, is going to a large extent be seen as an intellectual threat to the faith positions of theology, right? He was on the side of faith, on the side of the theologian, and therefore he saw reason, right, as not being able to play that fundamental formative role as we move to this third stage of life. He was therefore regarded to be one of the great irrationalists. And in fact, to a large extent, Kierkegaard is seen as one of the counter-enlightenment philosophers, a philosopher whose notions, whose ideas and so on oppose very much of Enlightenment philosophy. The next thinker is Friedrich Nietzsche. And again, like so many others, Nietzsche was the son of a pastor. In fact, Nietzsche said it. A lot of his predecessors were pastors, German pastors, Lutheran pastors. He went to the university, like Kierkegaard and like so many others, like Hegel, to study theology or to study theology and philosophy. But Nietzsche took a radically different position than Kierkegaard had taken. Like Kierkegaard, he was totally opposed to the Hegelian system. He was one of the main critics of Hegel, right? He was opposed to the Hegelian system because the Hegelian system had, as in the eyes of Kierkegaard, prioritized or privileged the individual over against this larger abstract kind of concept, right? One of the things that he was also opposed to Hegel about is the fact that Hegel provided what could be called a justification, a metaphysical justification for Christianity. And Nietzsche was opposed to metaphysics. In fact, Nietzsche's attack on metaphysical systems, although he had, in a sense, his own metaphysic, but his attack on the traditional metaphysical system was an extremely ferocious attack, totally intolerant of them, right? He was against the privileging of reason. And very interestingly, in his writings, instead of seeing reason as that main force, the Hegelian system is a very rationalistic system. Hegel says that the real is the rational the real, right? Similar to the Leibnizian system. We live in the best of all possible worlds. Everything that is real is also very rational. It justifies itself because it's real. Nietzsche was totally opposed to that and privileging of reason, and clearly therefore opposed to the totality of the Hegelian notion of absolute spirit and the dialectical movement of absolute spirit. So he was an irrationalist also. Like Kierkegaard, he objected to the prioritization of reason. And he argued that instead of reason, when we look at the natural world, we are seeing something called the will to power. We're not seeing reason at all. We are seeing it's like the Hobbesian, it's a kind of Hobbesian vision. But we are seeing the workings of the will to power in the natural world. We are seeing the workings of the will to power. Even at the realm of vegetation alone, we can see that struggle and that striving. Right? In the vegetative world, in the animal world, a struggle of the will to power. Animals depending on their physical equipment and resources in order not only Yes, there was a break there. Seeing in that world an attempt to triumph over others. In the world of man, all we see is an expression of that same fundamental striving for power. And you're taking this notion from another philosopher, another philosopher who was one of his contemporaries, Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer had said all that we see in the world is will and ideas, ideas emerging out of will formation. Will was now made central, not reason, not the sensory faculties that we have, but the will, the urging to master our space, to again, there was a break in the recording, but I'm continuing, and I'm talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, right? So that what Nietzsche envisaged was the striving, that perpetual striving for mastery and control, for power, the will to power, evident in everything. And in fact, he saw that will to power as a very, as contaminating the area of knowledge. When you look at knowledge, knowledge is not the pure reason that Kant spoke about, nor even the practical reason that he spoke about. Knowledge was saturated by an urge to power, and everybody wanted to make their intellectual systems dominant over against that of others. They would argue for their own philosophical positions. We see it very. Nietzsche wrote a number of books, and in one of them, The Genealogy of Morals, he launches a violent attack on Christian ethics. The Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche is engaged in what he calls a transvaluation of values. Now, a lot of people may have turned away from Christianity, but there was always a tremendous admiration for the ethic of the Sermon on the Mount, Christ's enunciation of a new ethic, right, that would guide the moral life of the individual. But Nietzsche was extremely critical of the Christian ethic, of the Sermon on the Mount. He considered it to be a slave morality, a morality only fit for those who wanted to be subservient or who accepted a position of subservience and victimhood. He says that we have to return to an era of heroic values, of courage and determination and strength of will. Those are the ethical values. And his critique of Christianity was an extremely severe critique. He totally rejected Christian asceticism, the asceticism of the medieval period. He totally rejected the notion of subordination of the flesh, right, or of the conquest of the flesh for the triumph of the spirit. As far as Nietzsche was concerned, flesh and spirit were all one, and that the individual should certainly develop those qualities that allow him to transcend himself, to become more than human. In fact, one of his interesting concepts was the concept of the Superman, so that man has to become Superman. One of his most famous books really was Thus Spake Zarathustra. And Nietzsche made an announcement in Thus Spake Zarathustra that continues to reverberate down through the decades of the 19th and 20th centuries. Zarathustra is supposed to be the father of the Zarathustrian religion, religionists, or the Zoroastrian religion. Another name is Zoroaster. But he wrote a beautiful sort of prosaic poem in which he now became Zarathustra. And he's giving a number of accounts of Zarathustra's experience. And in one of those experiences that Zarathustra has, a madman is running down the road and he's declaring the death of God. He is shouting at the top of his voice, God is dead, God is dead. What Nietzsche has done there is to proclaim the death of God in the 19th century. And Nietzsche is talking about the death of God from two fundamental positions. First of all, he is an atheist and he is saying that there is no God, right? So God is dead, God is no longer. But he's also talking about the death of faith, because when he looks at Christendom, he's not seeing any evidence that people are guided or motivated by faith considerations. So the notion of the death of God became one of the, I would say, one of the watchwords of modernity, in that both modernity's secularism, materialism, and atheism seem to be captured in the concept of the death of God and Nietzsche's atheism, but simultaneously the notion of the death of religious faith and the marginalization of Christianity within a very secular modernistic culture was captured in that phrase. So the concept of the death of God is a concept that Nietzsche enunciates. Later on, Foucault continues, and when we come to postmodernism, we'll deal with Foucault. He talks about the death of man, that no longer is humanism tolerable when he speaks about the death of man. But Nietzsche had also indicated, he gave some intimations of that movement towards the death of man, because he was saying we have to get rid of man and we have to create the Superman. The Superman must be a being that transcends humanity. Like Kierkegaard, he looked at humanity and he saw humanity with its foibles and its weaknesses and so on, and human culture with so many negative aspects that retarded true growth and development and civilization. And therefore he felt that there was something unacceptable and disgusting about humanity as it is. And so we have to move to the level of the Superman. Or that notion was eventually taken and abused by people like the Nazis and so on. Hitler, German like Nietzsche, came to develop a kind of raciological theory in which he perceived the Aryan peoples as a master race and having a moral mandate to take control of all of human history and human culture and human civilization and provide guidance and leadership, creating the Superman. So as far as Hitler was concerned, the Superman would be found within the Aryan peoples and so on. I would not blame Nietzsche for providing a philosophy that informed National Socialism in Germany, nor fascism in Italy. But they came to utilize very many of his ideas. They espouse many of his ideas and use it to justify these very racist and diabolical philosophies that have caused so much pain and suffering in the 20th century. Another very significant and interesting book he wrote was one called The Birth of Tragedy. And in The Birth of Tragedy, he's talking about how tragedy emerged in ancient Greece. Remember, the Greeks were the inventors of tragedy. Tragedy emerged among the ancient Greeks. But in his description of that emergence, he is seeing not only in ancient Greek society, but in all of Western society, an interesting kind of dialectic. And he calls it a conflict between the god Apollo and the god Dionysius. He mystifies, if you wish, or mythicalizes the notion of that civilizational conflict or contradiction. When you look at the evolution of Western civilization, you are seeing on the one hand, rationality and order, but on the other hand, you are seeing chaos and destructiveness. Apollo is the god of rationality and order. Dionysius is the god of chaos and destructiveness. And he's saying that all of human civilization and history witnesses a struggle between Apollo on the one hand and Dionysius on the other. And that is a That is a characteristic of the society in which we live. There is no getting out of it. There is no transcendence of that dialectic. Again, he does not proceed, right, in the fashion of Hegel to find a resolution for that conflict. It is a conflict that is perpetual, that will continue. And given the law of eternal recurrence, which he believes in, right, he talks about the law of eternal recurrence. It is a phenomenon that will keep recurring throughout the story of human civilization. Nietzsche has had a powerful influence on Western society. He declared himself an immoralist. He declared himself a nihilist. He was the first nihilist, he said, in Western European thought, right? Nietzsche saw himself as the Antichrist. He declared that he was the Antichrist and opposed the Christian ethical and philosophical systems or metaphysical systems, totally opposed to it. So Nietzsche has had a powerful influence on a lot of the thinkers that came after him, all of those who were predisposed to marginalizing and opposing traditional Christian worldviews and values, right? They see in Nietzsche their predecessor. They see in Nietzsche their mentor and their model. He continues to have a very powerful influence in modern society. And almost all of the postmodernists look back to Nietzsche as someone who anticipated the critique of modern society that they are now engaged in.